when, on May 11, 1846, President of the United States James K. Polk urged Congress and the American nation to declare war on Mexico due to Mexican troops firing on Americans in disputed territory. Many Americans from all walks of life rejected his message. Some people were in opposition because they did not agree with Polk's rationale for declaring war. Some people opposed the war because they saw it as an attempt to spread the institution of slavery. Others believed that it was unjust for the United States to wage war on a sister American republic. Others simply wished to avoid the destruction and bloodshed associated with warfare. Some Americans opposed the war because they did not want the United States population to be diluted by Mexicans, who, in the words of Ohio Congressman Columbus Delano,
embrace all shades of color, a sad compound of Spanish, English, Indian, and Negro bloods, and resulting, it is said, in the production of a slothful, ignorant race of beings.
united only in the common goal of stopping the war with Mexico, this diverse group of anti-war activists utilized a wide range of protest tactics. The most prominent of those tactics included engaging in congressional debates, utilizing the media in order to persuade the American people, and taking direct action, specifically civil disobedience, mutiny, and desertion, in order to prevent the waging of war. One of the earliest forms of protest against the war came from Congress, as a small group of so-called conscience Whigs attempted to stop the war before it could begin. Some congressmen made legalistic claims, highlighting President Polk's flimsy war justifications. Georgia Senator John Berrien, for example, argued that the presence of a Mexican army in disputed territory did not presuppose the existence of a war because, in his view, the Mexican army had the same right to be in that territory as an American army. Ohio Representative Joshua Giddings stated that,
I regard the message as having been put forth to divert public attention from the outrage committed by the President upon our own Constitution, and the exercise of usurped powers of which he has been guilty in ordering our army to invade a country with which we are at peace, and of provoking and bringing on this war.
Some congressmen also made more moralistic arguments, highlighting the human costs of a war with Mexico. Giddings, for example, said that Polk's actions were done
all for the purpose of justifying himself in sending the army to the Rio Grande and commencing the work of human butchery.
And he furthermore stated that,
when the executive and Congress openly and avowedly took upon themselves the responsibility of extending and perpetuating slavery, my confidence in the stability of our institutions was shaken, destroyed. Despite these arguments, the motion to declare war on Mexico still passed overwhelmingly, 174 to 14 votes in the House of Representatives and 40 to 2 votes in the Senate.
Then, even after the war started, some congressmen continued their opposition by voting against war appropriations bills. Ohio Senator Thomas Corwin voted against an 1847 appropriations bill, explaining,
Mr. President, this uneasy desire to augment our territory has deprived our moral senses and blunted the otherwise keen sagacity of our people.
Corwin also threatened that,
should we prosecute this war another moment, or expend $1 in the purchase or conquest of a single acre of Mexican land, the North and South are brought into collision on a point where neither will yield.
Some congressmen also made general statements against the war. Then Representative Abraham Lincoln, for example, introduced the famous spot resolutions, which urged the president to name
the spot of soil on which the blood of our citizens was shed,
and explain whether that spot was rightful American territory. Ultimately, however, most congressmen did not vote against the war or against war appropriations because, as one historian put it, they did not want to risk the accusation that they were putting American soldiers in peril by depriving them of the materials necessary to fight. In the end, the conscience Whigs were ineffective at preventing the war, as they were outvoted by the pro-war Cotton Whigs and the near-uniformly expansionist Democrats. While the war was ongoing, certain figures in the American media attempted to use propaganda to sway public opinion against the war. Anti-war journalism came from several prominent newspapers, such as William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. Garrison described,
"This is a war of aggression, of invasion, of conquest, of rapine, marked by ruffianism, perfidy, and every other feature of national depravity."
Frederick Douglass, in his North Star newspaper, stated that,
"This is a disgraceful, cruel, and iniquitous war with our sister republic. Mexico seems a doomed victim to Anglo-Saxon cupidity and love of dominion."
Horace Greeley's New York Tribune wrote in 1846,
"Is not life miserable enough? Comes not death soon enough without resort to the hideous enginery of war? People of the U.S., your rulers are precipitating you into a fathomless abyss of crime and calamity. Why sleep you thoughtless on its verge, as though this was not your business?"
In addition, some religious leaders offered sermons against the war. Reverend Francis Wayland, a Baptist minister and the president of Brown University, for example, urged his congregation in several speeches to not enlist or loan money to the federal government. Unitarian minister Theodore Parker declared in 1847,
"Would it be infamous for a New England man to enlist, for a New England merchant to loan his dollar, or to let his ships in aid of this wicked war? Would it be infamous for a manufacturer to make a cannon, a sword, or a kernel of powder to kill our brothers with? But we all know that they are in the right, and we in the wrong."
Some political cartoonists attempted to protest through drawings, such as those described below.
This piece, titled "Volunteers for Texas, As You Were," was published at the very beginning of the war in 1846, and it criticizes the quality of American soldiers. The artist shows an awkward group of volunteers standing at attention before a young, chinless, and obviously untested officer who regards them through a monocle. This morbid piece, titled "A New Rule in Algebra," satirizes the treatment of Mexican prisoners of war by American doctors, who often resorted to amputations as a first treatment against limb infections.
Protests against the war, both from Congress and the media, were largely centered in the Northeast, as many Northerners saw the war as an effort to empower the South by expanding the institution of slavery. The New England Workingmen's Association, for example, declared that,
"We will not take up arms to sustain the Southern slaveholder in robbing 1/5 of our countrymen of their labor."
The effect that all of this propagandizing had on the overall war effort is difficult to gauge, but it is likely that public opinion began to sour on the war after the first few months, and this, if nothing else, made recruiting soldiers more difficult. In response to falling numbers of volunteers after 1846, the Army lowered physical health requirements, Congress increased monetary promises to enlisting soldiers, and recruiters became more aggressive. In addition to polite debates and persuasion, some anti-war activists took to direct action, hoping to achieve their goals by materially disrupting the war effort. When discussing direct action of this time, one topic invariably comes up: civil disobedience. The term civil disobedience was coined in the 1840s by transcendentalist author Henry David Thoreau in his essay of the same name, to describe those who do not conform to government rule, and thus free themselves of complicity in that government's actions. As Thoreau put it,
"I am too high-born to be propertied, to be a secondary at control, or useful serving man and instrument to any sovereign state throughout the world."
Thoreau believed that Americans ought to practice this form of protest because of the American government's role in waging the Mexican-American War and in upholding the system of slavery.
In other words, when a sixth of the population of a nation, which has undertaken to be the refuge of liberty, are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army, and subjected to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize.
Thoreau advocated this because, in his view, those who abet atrocities by remaining obedient to state laws are just as guilty as the far-off soldier who physically commits the atrocity. Thoreau, putting this ideology into practice, illegally evaded his taxes so as to deprive the government of the funds that it needed to wage the Mexican-American War, an act for which Thoreau was briefly imprisoned. A number of American soldiers, heeding the doctrine of civil disobedience, deserted from the army. There were nearly 7,000 deserters by the war's end, including almost 10% of the total regular army. Some soldiers went even further than civil disobedience, and instead committed treason as a form of protest through actions such as mutinies. In August 1847, members of the 1st North Carolina Volunteer Regiment mutinied against Colonel Robert Treat Paine, partially for political reasons and partially for personal reasons related to Army discipline. The mutineers hurled stones and insults at Paine, and the mutiny did not stop until Paine personally shot and killed one of the volunteers. In some even more extreme cases, American soldiers defected to the Mexican side. The St. Patrick's Battalion, for example, was formed by Irish soldier John Riley in order to fight for Mexico. The battalion was composed of hundreds of defectors, primarily first-generation Irish-American immigrants. Soldiers in the St. Patrick's Battalion, known as San Patricios, defected for several reasons, including resentment toward the treatment of common soldiers by American higher-ups, monetary offers by the Mexican government, sympathy with Mexicans as fellow Catholics, and general disillusionment with the war as an unjust and futile cause. The battalion fought with distinction in several battles, including those at Buena Vista and at Churubusco, and they are still honored in Mexico today. All of this shows that a number of anti-war protesters at this time were willing to resort to direct illegal measures, be it the civil disobedience of Thoreau or the violent resistance of the San Patricios. In conclusion, congressional debate, popular propaganda, and direct action were just some of the most common tactics that anti-war activists used to protest the Mexican-American War. Ultimately, though, these pacifists were unable to prevent the war or to prevent the United States from annexing Mexican territory. The popularity of Manifest Destiny ideology, the dominance of the American military over the Mexican military despite internal unrest, and the geographic sectionalism within the anti-war movement all contributed to the immediate failure of the anti-war movement. That does not, however, mean that the movement was useless. Though the movement could not stop the war, it did produce more lenient peace terms. The increasing war weariness of both politicians and common Americans by 1848 played a major role in the ratification of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that year, which gave the Mexican government $15 million and allowed Mexico to retain about two-thirds of its territory. Though this treaty was certainly harsh on Mexico, it was still much more lenient than what the United States otherwise could have forced onto Mexico, given the overwhelming success of the American army and the hawkishness of Democratic leaders such as President Polk and Congressman Jefferson Davis, who wished to annex half or more of Mexico and give zero monetary concessions. Instead, due to the pressure in Congress and the media, and the on-the-ground efforts by soldiers and civilians to frustrate the war effort, the war was shortened, and a harsher settlement was avoided. The anti-war efforts, then, were not entirely in vain. The script for this video is just a slightly modified version of a paper that I wrote for school. Basically, I wrote the paper, and it was an interesting subject, which I wanted to make into a video, but I didn't want to spend too much time on it, which is why, as you can see, I haven't done too much editing, so if it's less, I guess, visually engaging than some of my other explainer videos, then I'm sorry about that, although, considering that you've reached this point in the video, clearly you've been at least engaged enough to continue watching this far. I will also say that this is just a very brief overview of the subject, not really a deep dive. I could go much deeper into any one of the particular people involved or the forms of protest. For instance, there were a lot more congressional quotes which I could have quoted. There's a lot more newspaper articles and sermons which I could have quoted. I didn't even get into the poetry, the anti-war poetry that came out of this war. Really, the San Patricios, they deserve a whole video of their own, just because of how interesting they were. I really only scratched the surface on them. And also, I didn't really get into how the anti-war movement affects us today. How it compares to later anti-war movements in American history, or the concept of civil disobedience, what exactly that means, and how it's been used throughout history in the United States and elsewhere. I mean, again, that's a whole nother video, another paper, very interesting on its own, but I didn't have that much time to get into it here. So, if you are interested in learning more about this, I have linked all of my sources in the description below for you to check them out if you want.
By the way, you may have noticed that some of the quotes read during this video were not read by me. Rather, they were read by a good friend of mine named Jonathan Teagan, who runs the YouTube channel Civil War Week by Week. If you are interested in mid-19th century American history, which I imagine you are if you've gotten to this point in the video, then you'll also be interested in his channel, because that's what his channel is all about. So check that out. I've left the link in the description. That's all, and I will see you next time.
Myself and 200 Irishmen decided to rise to the call. From Dublin City to San Diego, we witnessed freedom denied. So we formed the St. Patrick Battalion, and we fought on the Mexican side. We formed the St. Patrick Battalion, and we fought on the Mexican side.